Good morning everyone and welcome to the Glenelg Hopkins CMA's roam on the Victorian Volcanic Grasslands for our final live event for the Victorian Nature Festival. Thank you all to the people who've got up nice and early this morning. We've all had 1 hour less sleep. There was many alarms set this morning to make sure we got out here on time. So we are out in southwest Victoria. We're not going to disclose exactly where we are because there's a very special little plant on the roadside where we are today that we don't want people to actually come and see on their own. We will host some tours when we can. This morning, we're going to meet with the Glenelg Hopkins CMA's VVP project team in Aggie and Ben. The VVP project is part of a federally funded National Landcare program that the CMA delivers. So for anyone who's been following us this week on our live broadcast, we have no sun, we have no wind, we have a little bit of rain, so we've almost crossed off all the gamuts, but hopefully it's going to be weather-wise quite fine today for us to have a look at the grasslands, which are actually flowering. So this morning, Aggie and Ben will not have masks on because they are out in the field and they're going to be talking to camera. I'm going to quickly put my mask on to do this recording, and we hope you enjoy our wander of the grasslands. So we'll get this worked out, turn you all around, and we'll be happy days. I would think that I would be better at getting this organised now. Good morning, everyone. So here we have Aggie and Ben. These are our VVP project team members, and they're going to take you for our walk around the grasslands. So Ben, you're going to kick us off and talk about these grasslands. What is the VVP?
Okay, so the VVP is one of Victoria's largest bioregions, and it's essentially a geological landform made up of around 400 volcanic eruption points that spread out from the western suburbs of Melbourne all the way out to where we are today in southwest Victoria, heading towards Hamilton. The oldest eruption points are sort of around 5 million years ago, and they sort of tend to be closer to Melbourne, and then we got our younger eruption points which sort of went off around 10,000 years ago here at the western end. And on average, we would have seen a volcano across this landscape every 10,000 years as sort of pressure built up underneath the crust of the earth and sort of spewed out across the plains. And that sort of led to a lot of basalt rock. And then as that basalt over time has weathered down, it's weathered down to what is quite a heavy clay soil. And heavy clays are really important for grasslands. A lot of trees will struggle to establish on these types of soils due to the cracking that happens in summer and the waterlogging that happens over winter. The grasses are really well adapted, and so that would have been the dominant land cover at the time of European settlement, and that's sort of what we're seeing here is a remnant linear strip of native grassland on a roadside out here in southwest Victoria.
So Aggie, can you tell us what sort of grasses we're actually looking at this morning?
I can. So the main grass we've got here is the Demeter triandra, so the kangaroo grass, which is the dominant grass on this ecosystem. And as I may explain later, this is actually a grass that's travelled down from the tropics. But as you can see, if we look out, it really is, it is the main grass species here. Other grasslands are more dominated by spear grasses, wallaby grasses, but here where we are today, it's a kangaroo grass. Probably the thing that kangaroo grass mostly needs is to be burnt regularly, because otherwise it builds up biomass, as we can see here with the dead biomass, that it builds up very quickly. So it really needs to be burnt on an annual or every sort of 3 to 4 years maximum to maintain this open, I suppose, open form of the grassland. So we have the intertussock spaces, because the important part about that is that's where all the beautiful herbs grow. Now, how we get these roadsides burnt is from our wonderful CFA volunteers. That's, if it's not for the CFA brigade and their decades of burning, we wouldn't have these amazing grasslands remaining. So, and how we do that, so this isn't just about departments, agencies working on these areas. We work very closely with private landholders. So we are right next to a farm, obviously, and you'll see there between the grassland and the fence is a maintained fire break. And that's what we make sure is installed along all the roadsides of high quality grasslands that get burnt, and that's when our wonderful volunteers come in on an annual, every couple of years basis and do the burning. It protects assets, it protects lives, it protects communities, and for us it protects all these amazing plants that are here on the grasslands that we're going to show you today.
So we'll go for a wander along. If you can tell us what we're going to be looking at here. We'll find some flowers or some plants along here.
So here we've got some of our common daisies that we get in the grasslands. We've got some common everlasting which hasn't started flowering yet, but we do have these scaly buttons. And so the daisies are a really important component of the native grasslands. They make up about sort of 16% of the flora. And then it's similar sort of with the grasses. We have kangaroo grasses, which is the dominant grass, but we have a whole heap of subordinate grasses as well. And so those two families really dominate the plains. We also have some of the native lilies. And so we have here the Picardia. And it's like a lot of the native herbs we'll have in these grasslands. It will have a tuber, and those tubers are probably really important for Aboriginal people as a food source, as a carbohydrate source. And then Aggie's got over here some of the our carnivorous plants. So we have the Drosseras here. So the Drosseras have quite a nice scent that will attract insects, and the insects will get sort of stuck on these glands here, and that will help to supplement, I suppose, sort of supplement the diet of these plants. Is that they'll sort of digest those insects and get their nutrients.
And we've also got here very little not open cesia, so a little blue grass lily. There's a lot of these guys here, so you can see they do look a lot like grass at the moment, but then you get down in here close and you see a flower head just coming up. So in probably 4 weeks or so this will be absolutely spectacular, and just a sea of purple around here. So what have we got next? And you'll see, as we're walking along, if we just look down again, we talk about these intertussock spaces. So we talk about the grasses being grass tussocks. So we have a tussock here, 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 here. These are the intertussock spaces. So this is what's so important for the herbs, because we can see this is where the herbs are growing. So if we don't burn this kangaroo grass, and we just have a big build-up of thatch, we don't have these spaces, so we don't have the wildflowers to grow. And
the other thing you can see here is these crusts. And so these crusts play a really important role in helping to prevent weeds from becoming established in these grasslands. So what you can see here, it is a linear remnant. We've got a road just there, we've got a farm just here, and so it's got a lot of edge. And ecological theory will predict if you've got a lot of edge, you're going to have a lot of edge effects and a lot of weeds moving in. But what we've got is actually a grassland that isn't doing that. It's actually pretty clean of weeds. And that's because, in part, these soil crusts, which provide a bit of a barrier for exotic species that struggle to sort of put their seeds through this and germinate on these, whereas a lot of our native plants have actually developed adaptations to germinate either on top of the crusts or able to get their seeds through it. So it's a really important component of the grasslands in just keeping those weeds out. That's why, disturbing the soils is a really bad thing to happen in grasslands, because it sort of kicks over this soil crust. It provides the opportunity then for those weeds to move in.
If we come over here, we've got over here some stachyalsia, so candles. I think we can see where they get their name from. These are another gorgeous little herb. And there's also some rice flower around somewhere, but just these rocks here. This is a really important feature of the grasslands on the volcanic plains. So these areas are really important for the plants, but also the animals that actually live in these areas. So when the soils open up, when it gets dry, that's where the lizards and the fat-tailed dunarts go down, so the striped legless lizards. But also, they live under these rocks. So Well, some people might think rocks just get in the way. There's actually lots of little cracks and crevices where little animals, fat-tailed dunnuts and insects will go in and they can shelter, and especially when a roadside burn is happening, they can hide under the rocks or down the cracks in the soil. So there's every little thing on the roadsides are really important, not only for the plants, but also for the animals that live here.
We've got some of the pine lilies that Aggie mentioned here. So we've got a couple of species of these rice flowers, and so these are shrubs, unlike the herbs. So these are about as big as the shrubs tend to get on the volcanic plains, and they're small shrubs that are adapted to resprouting every year after they get burnt. So we've got the Pimelia humilis here and the Pimelia curviflora. And there's also the spiny rice flower, Pimelia spinescens, which is also on the volcanic plains, and it is on this roadside further up, and that is a species that's critically endangered.
So we have down here, while it's not this for this year, but sometimes in grasslands all we've got to go on is last year's flower stem, and that's what we've got here. So this is the last year's flower stem from an endangered Prassophyllum, so a leek orchid. Obviously it's not doing much at the moment, but that just sometimes when we're doing surveys, that's all we've got to go on, is sort of what was here last year. Because orchids can be a little bit fickle and we won't see them every single year. And they'll have really good years and some not so good. But there are lots of orchids along here.
So Aggie was talking about the thermita earlier on. So this is our dominant species, and you can see here we've got a lot of dead litter building up. With thermita, you can see we've got this year's leaves, and it'll produce new leaves every year, but those leaves only live for that year and then they die off. And so you ended up with all this dead biomass. And what will happen is that's quite high in silica, so it doesn't break down, it just sits in the ecosystem. And so if you don't burn it, it'll just continue to accumulate, and then once you get to a point of sort of pushing it past 10 years, you will have got to a point where a lot of these daisies and lilies and things in those intertussock spaces have already dropped out. They don't have a persistent seed bank, so they're unlikely to come back in once you put the fire back in. But also it gets to a point where it starts smothering itself with its build-up of litter, and it can actually push it far enough and it can cause the collapse of the ecosystem. At that point you can see the weeds start to move in. So burning is really essential, and at this part of the volcanic plain in the southwest where it's quite a high rainfall and very productive, we find that the best grasslands tend to be those that have been burnt every year. And we know that local volunteers around here have been doing that since at least the 1930s. We have historical records of meeting minutes going back that far. And it's also likely to be how Aboriginal people would have managed the plains prior to Europeans' arrival. And for them it would have been really important in maintaining a lot of their food plants.
What we have here is my #1 favourite on the grasslands, the gorgeous twining fringe lily here. And I'm not sure how well you can see this, but this beauty is growing up one little stem of a lemon beauty head plant, which are these plants here, the lighter silvery colour. But these, if you can get in really close, you see they've got fringed leaves, fringed petals I should say, and that's just an absolute beauty, and there's quite a lot of that along here. And we've also got here, well, the lemon beauty heads, as I said, the Callocephalus citrius. So there's two plants in this genus. We've got this, the Callocephalus citrius, which is the lemon beauty head, which tends to grow in the drier parts, and then in wetter areas of grassland we get the Callocephalus lacteus, which is the milky beauty heads, and they're just some really special plants. But we might just also quickly, before we move on, we've got down here the Plantago Chordi, which is a native Plantago. So a lot of people might think of this as a weed because there is Plantago lanceolata, which you get in lawns and nature strips and so on. But But this, I think, is a really overlooked little native plant. It's not flowering at the moment, but you can see it's got sort of toothed edges on its leaves, and it's much more erect than the weedy one. But it's just another, there's so many different types of plants in the grasslands, so there's just something for absolutely everyone.
We've also got some convolvulus here, and it's another species. So this is a native bindweed, but there are actually introduced convolvuluses as well. So this has close relatives that aren't actually from this area. And so we're quite early in the season for grasslands. It's really just starting to kick off now, but a lot of the things we'll see sort of in early October will be the orchids, and I think Aggie's got some of the sun orchids here. And this will it'll slowly sort of continue to see more and more species come into flower, and it really peaks sort of mid-November around here. And then things sort of drop off pretty quickly after that. We'll see a lot of our plants have already flowered, they set seed, and they'll actually die back to dormant tubers that will sit below the soil surface. And then when the local CFA brigade come in, they'll usually burn this in sort of late summer, early autumn. And by that stage, a lot of our diversity is actually, it's not present in the standing vegetation anymore. It's still alive, but it's just sitting below the soil surface. And so all that's really left is the grasses. And the grasses are really tolerant to fire. Their growing points are really close to the soil surface, and so they resprout really well. And we find that when we burn these grasslands, we find that the residence time, so the amount of time that the fire sits on one point, is really, really short. It just continues to move along, and as a result, the soils don't really heat very much. Everything that's below the soil surface is actually really well protected from fire, and it gets rid of all that grass biomass. And then as the winter rains come back in, you'll come when winter rains come in, you'll see all these species start to resprout, and then it's sort of a slow process as they reach their sort of peak in November and then quickly drop off again.
And I think probably the most important thing here, as we touched on at the beginning, is that burning these areas, that's what they want, and that's what we want, because we're just left with this fantastic fire break with offering no fire risk, so cars can travel safely on the roads during the risk of a fire, which is really important and what we have to keep. Now down here we've got one of our sun orchids, so Thelomitra pauciflora.
Looks like pauciflora, that one, yep.
Yep, so this is pretty special because these basically will only open up when it's sunny. So obviously the sun's looking down on us, yeah. But there's a couple of listed Thelomitra on this roadside, but this is one of the more common ones, but still, I think you'll agree, pretty stunning, really. And right behind it, we've got, this is a Dianella, so Flax Lily. So there's a few different species of Dianella here. I can't actually say which one it is.
This would be Revoluta, this one.
Okay, yep. There we go, Revoluta. But yet another of the lilies. So again, just something else that, you know, makes the diversity in these roadsides so amazing.
And so we're sort of focusing more on the plants today, but there are a lot of native animals in these systems as well. Aggie spoke before about the fat-tailed dunnart, and that's probably the last small mammal we see on these grasslands. Most of the others have now been lost. But we know that it's on this roadside, and as Aggie said, these rocks are really important. They'll burrow in under that, and that's where they'll live. And they're like a little carnivore that roams these grasslands, feeding on all the insects that we see in here.
So it really is just pretty magical. And we've got some more orchids over here. Now, some people might just think, what's so important about these grasslands? Obviously, Ben said, you know, how they're created. There's quite a few estimates of how much grassland actually remains, but I think we sort of stick with around probably less than 0.5% of its original extent remains, and that is largely on roadsides. There are native grasslands on public land, and Ben and I work with landholders through our roles at the CMA with guys who have native grasslands on their private property, and we work with them to get a good grazing regime happening. But here on roadsides, obviously grazing isn't an option. It's burning. It's the quickest, easiest, cheapest way to maintain these absolute gems. And really, if we lose these areas, then what have we got for our future generations? It's just a real loss. So we have to do what we can to protect these. If I can just stop now.
And we've got some of our golden moth orchids here as well, our Drosseras.
And we're getting very close to something very, very exciting that hopefully you've all been following avidly. But maybe before we get to that one, we've got here another of my favourites. I know you're not meant to have favourites, but you can't help it. So these are the Brunonia Australis, the blue pincushions. So while they're not open yet, these will open up into the most magnificent light blue, and they will form carpets. But another little daisy that, and so each time you can come to a grassland each week and it will almost be a different colour depending on what's peaking at the time.
It's this Brunonia. For a while there, it was considered the only species in its genus, but it's recently been reclassified, and so it's now been clumped in with the gardenias, which are these yellow flowering plants here.
And it's interesting, there's actually gardenias as small grassland plants, and you can also get the Gardenia ovata, which is a large shrub as well, which clearly we don't get here. We get the little grass.
We are moving to the exciting part of the morning. For those people who do follow the Glenelg Hopkins CMA Facebook page and its little fun sister page, the Lonely Button Wrinklewort, which is a very funny little story. This little plant is our wrinklewort. Tell us about this plant.
Well, this plant, this is the only one here on this site. And this is where we make a bit of a shout out to Carl Just, who stumbled across this doing a routine flora survey here last year. And that happened not long after Ben and I had visited the 9 known sites across Western Victoria of the Rutedosis leptorhynchoides, or the button wrinklewort. It's a perennial daisy. It's listed as critically endangered under national environmental law. So we actually run a project as well, purely to protect this species. But yeah, so the fact that there's just one plant here, while it's really exciting, we need to think about, well, how is it going to germinate and grow more babies?
So does it cross-pollinate with itself?
No, so this, he said this is one of the rarest plants on the volcanic plains, and it is self-incompatible. It can't pollinate itself. So this plant being all on its own with no partners, it's kind of got to do in future unless that we intervene. And so that's what we've been doing. We have got another population sort of about 40 minutes north of here, where we've got about sort of 40 to 50 plants growing naturally in the wild. And so what we were doing last spring is, as they were coming into flower, we would chop off one of the flowers from up the road, drive down and rub those flowers together, trying to get some pollen transfer. And then we continued to do that throughout sort of early summer, and then in late summer we bagged up all the flowers, and then we came back and snapped those off and collected those, and then grew them in our home nursery down in Port Fairy. And then we've had some success. We've actually been able to grow some of these buttons from that seed. We still have to be a little bit cautious with this, because there is this weird kind of chromosomal thing going on with the button wrinkleworts, where we've got these 2 different races. So we've got one race that's the more common one throughout around Melbourne and into New South Wales and the ACT. And then we've got these tetraploids, which are out in Western Victoria. They're a bigger, more robust version of the button wrinklewort, but the issue is they can't reproduce with each other. And we don't actually know what this one is. We're assuming it's a tetraploid because the distribution would say it's a tetraploid. It looks a bit like a tetraploid, but we don't actually know. So we've grown our seed, and we'll actually keep these in the nursery for a little bit and actually seed and see if we can get the next generation coming through based on these seedlings. And if that works, then great. We can be pretty certain we've got a tetraploid here, and then we can look to supplement this individual and get some more plants in the ground. But if it doesn't, then we actually might have something really weird going on, and we've got one of the diploids out here in Western Victoria. And so what this process is it's a process of speciation. So we're actually seeing this species heading on its evolutionary journey from its ancestors over there in Melbourne to become potentially a new species, and that's what these tetraploids kind of are on that process. And they've got to the point now where they're no longer able to reproduce with their ancestors.
And probably one of the key things with button is only found on public land, which suggests to us that it does not like being grazed by livestock, and it's fine with burning. So that's yet another reason why it's so critical that we look after these linear reserves. So we're obviously here on a roadside. You may have heard some cars going past this morning. We also work with rail track companies, because obviously that's where a lot of the really special grasslands remain also. So we will just keep on working with all these partners. So we work with local government, DELP, Corangamite CMA, other partners, utilities that have assets on roadsides. And it's really important that we just continue to engage with these guys to make sure they understand the significance of these areas. And it might be something as simple as saying, hey guys, don't do maintenance in the middle of winter when you're going to bog up the grassland, because that can be one of the worst possible things. It's breaking that soil crust that Ben mentioned before, and once you've done that, that's when you're open to weed invasion. So it's always pretty simple messaging, but we just sort of keep on going and working with our fantastic volunteers, like the guys who are right next to us.
So guys, this has been a good little walk around the grasslands. Is there anything before we sign off that you'd like to tell us all about this amazing place? It's a pretty open, flat area. It is the Volcanic Plains, but we can see a tiny little mound in the distance over there. That's not natural, is it?
No. So that will be a pile where boulders have most likely been piled up in years gone by, and just soil has accumulated around it. And because it's disturbed, it's where the weed seed sets and is growing. So as part of our work with DELP and CFA and local government, through the Linear Reserves project, we come in with specialised weed contractors to target areas like that, just to keep the weeds from encroaching into this really amazing grassland here. So, you know, as always, there's only so much we can do, but we work very strategically to target the really top areas and look after those, and then we can start to focus on the more medium quality grasslands and go from there.
And that now finishes our little half an hour wander around the grasslands of the volcanic plains of Victoria. Thank you for coming along this morning. We do understand there were some buffering issues that a lot of you mentioned along the way. This is our worst service area to be doing this with just one bar of service, but we will upload this video, which shouldn't have any connectivity issues in it, to our Facebook page as soon as we get back into town with better service and signal to do that for you. It will also be put up onto the Glenelg Hopkins CMA live recordings. Amazing. It'll be also put up on the Glenelg Hopkins CMA website, and so all of that should take out any of those buffering issues that a lot of you had this morning. Thank you for those people who persevered with it. The Victoria Nature Festival does still keep going for another week. If you wanted to go to vic.gov.au/ournature, or you can check out the Glenelg Hopkins website, which is ghcma.vic.gov.au, to have a look at the projects that we also do. And there's lots of project videos that you might find interesting, and people who we work with. So thank you very much for coming along this morning, and enjoy daylight saving, and we hope you've enjoyed our roam around the grasslands.